Good morning, you're watching Daybreak with me, Nadia Jani.
And me, Lou Brown, and we're ready to wake you up with all you need to know about the key stories making their way across the world and in the region.
Here are your top stories. Russian drone missiles kill at least 25 people, and US and Moscow officials draft plan to end war.
US President Donald Trump signs bill that orders the release of the Epstein files.
And at least 25 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli strikes across the Gaza Strip. First this morning, Ukraine has been hit by one of the largest Russian aerial attacks in months, striking multiple regions and causing heavy casualties. The assault comes as Kyiv pushes its allies for stronger air defense support as US officials arrive for high-level talks.
Alongside this, US and Russian officials have quietly drafted a new plan to end the war in Ukraine, but it would require Kyiv to surrender territory and severely limit the size of its military. Here's more on that story.
At least 26 people have been killed in a major Russian missile and drone attack on the western Ukrainian city of Ternopil, according to officials. The upper floors of a residential building were torn away, and debris and personal belongings were scattered across the area as thick smoke rose over the city. More than 90 people were wounded.
As you can hear, the equipment ceased its operation. A moment of silence has been declared to be able to hear possible survivors under the rubble. Around 30 minutes ago, we made contact with a young person in their 20s. The rescuers keep constant contact with him.
The military says X-101 cruise missiles hit the residential block in Ternopil, which is a city close to the Polish border that has rarely been targeted.
My son is still in the apartment on the 9th floor. I talked to him before the explosions. That's it. He said, "Mom, everything will be fine. Don't worry." After this, I tried calling and couldn't reach him. I know nothing.
Ukraine says Russia fired 476 drones and 48 missiles overnight, hitting energy and transport sites and forcing emergency power cuts during freezing temperatures. Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk regions were also struck, while drone attacks in Kharkiv injured more than 30 people, setting buildings and cars on fire. Ukraine's Air Force reports shooting down 442 drones and 41 missiles, including 10 intercepted by F-16 and Mirage 2000 jets provided by Western allies. Russia's defense ministry says it carried out a massive strike using long-range precision weapons, claiming it targeted Ukraine's military industry and energy sector. It says it's in response to Ukrainian attacks on civilian sites inside Russia. The attacks come as President Volodymyr Zelensky travelled to Turkey for talks aimed at reviving peace negotiations. He urged Kyiv's allies to increase pressure on Moscow and provide more air defence missiles. A high-level US military delegation, led by Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, arrived in Ukraine to discuss efforts to end the war. The team is expected to meet Zelensky in Kyiv after his return from Turkey. Ukrainian officials said the delegation was briefed on Russia's troop build-up, ongoing offensives, and recent attacks on civilian areas.
We're now going to take a look at the stories shaping the day across the globe. We go first to the BBC website, which is also leading with US military officials in Ukraine for talks on ending the war. Now, we know that Zelensky has been doing a round trip of Europe, meeting a number of senior leaders and officials. But this one, he'll be meeting with senior Pentagon officials, who arrive in Kyiv to discuss efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Alongside that, multiple outlets report the US and Russia Russia have prepared a 28-point peace plan involving major concessions from Ukraine. And the US has approved a $105 million support package for Ukraine's Patriot air defense system. So it does feel like these talks are going to be quite crucial and critical to the war in Ukraine and what the US involvement will be in alongside that.
Indeed, yeah, this comes against the backdrop of at least 26 killed in Russian missile and drone attack in Ternopil. Russia continues its intensified strikes as Ukraine braces for another winter of conflict with obviously the EU and NATO's assistance on this war as well. Zelensky has repeatedly refused any territorial concessions. Just to jump in on that 28-point plan, I'm assuming that will be in conflict with what will be in that plan as well. Moscow still demands that Ukraine cede territory, reduce its military and adopt neutrality, condition obviously, like we say, Kyiv rejects and is very unlikely to materialize or have any material ability on the peace plan that is being drafted so far. So yes, Russia insists on a ceasefire only under terms Ukraine describes as its capitulation. So obviously very different standings, very different accounts of what they will both want from this ceasefire if one is to be implemented at all. Let's have a look.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. And just to add also that Ukrainian officials, which is just an interesting line, say Russia is using Telegram to recruit Ukrainian youths to sabotage operations. So it's something that we haven't heard a lot of, but Russia is recruiting Ukrainian young people in order to sabotage certain operations in regards to the war in Ukraine. Now let's just go to the next website, which should also be, yes, so Zelensky met with Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Wednesday for peace process in Ankara. And as I had mentioned, he is doing the European rounds, and obviously his last stop was in Turkey. That was on Wednesday before he heads back to Kyiv to meet with US officials on Thursday, which is today. And also just to state that Zelensky met Erdogan in Ankara, and both leaders are calling for the revival of the Istanbul peace process. So Turkey is trying to act as a mediator between the two. Erdogan said Turkey is ready to discuss with Russia any proposals that could accelerate a ceasefire and pave the way for lasting peace. So it's something that all European countries as well as Turkey are basically getting into formation as to where peace can go and how to actually implement that.
Yes, just jump in there. We've talked a little bit, let's contextualize this now. We know that this isn't the first time they've held a summit together or had the topic of Russia-Ukraine in Turkey at all. Zelensky said coordination with partners like Turkey is central to preventing future conflicts and securing long-term peace. Now, one of the big things that could come out of this is the prisoner exchange negotiations that have been the main, let's say, progress on the story as well as in previous times at these summits. So Ankara continuing to mediate between Russia and Ukraine on this, and Erdogan did add, just finally, rising civilian casualties and attacks on energy infrastructure made renewed diplomacy very urgent. So Erdogan obviously taking a front seat as a world leader who's championing and trying to drive forward a peace solution to this conflict in Europe. Now let's have a look at our next story. We're just going to go on to, I believe, ABC News.
Yep.
With the Trump says he signed the Epstein bill. Obviously quite a story that's been going on for more so than months, and rather just years as well. So let's just say 20,000 pages of documents from Epstein's estate were released last week, including material mentioning the US President Donald Trump. 2018 messages from Epstein claimed he could, quote, take Trump down, and said, I know how dirty Donald is. So obviously some media interest, a lot of interest from the government and across the US on what will be in these files.
And just to jump in there, so Trump previously had opposed to the release of these documents, but has reversed his opinion after pressure from victims and key Republicans who are part of the MAGA movement. So we know that files must be released in a searchable and downloadable format. We don't know when that will happen, but now that he has signed the bill ordering that, we should see that in the next coming days. On Truth Social, President Donald Trump actually suggested that Democrats' associations with Epstein may be exposed. So he's also trying to push the spotlight away from him and more to the Democrats, obviously, because that's his main opposing party. But it'll be interesting to see what actually comes out, especially for the survivors who have been campaigning for this to find out exactly what's in it. And we know that there's a number of names that have already been mentioned mentioned, and the backlash that they've received. So I think for many people who may have had a relationship with Epstein, it's a time that they will definitely be quite afraid to find out what these files actually show and release in due course.
So let's flip over to our final story in our press review, Le Monde, and the continuing coverage on Israel and Gaza. I'll let you kick things off here, Nadia.
Yes, okay, so strikes and casualties. At least 25 people have been killed as far as we know, and this kicked off over last night. So 10 people, including a woman and a young girl, died when a religious endowments ministry building in Gaza City's neighborhood was hit. Now, these strikes follow what Israel said was Hamas gunfire at its soldiers operating in Khan Yunis, which it called a ceasefire violation. So we know this ceasefire happened in October, so it's just been a month and a couple of weeks, but Israel is saying they had just cause to do that, and this escalation came after several days of relatively calm under the ceasefire, but now this has happened. So it'll be interesting to see what the US response is to that.
Just a final point is that this comes against the backdrop of the UN passing Trump's latest international stabilization force. So be interesting to see how this story develops, and whether the peace in Gaza will be longing, and whether it will have new avenues emerge from that as well. So that is our press roundup. We're going to take a short break, but when we return, we'll discuss the rest of the global stories. Stay with us.
Inside Politics delves deeply into the heart of global issues shaping our world today. Join me for your go-to source of political analysis from across the region and beyond.
Unfiltered news and analysis from the region and beyond. From Washington to Beijing, Tehran to Kabul, to Tbilisi to Tashkent. Hello, I'm J-Dad. Challenges.
Today is the third.
We're with you 24/7, taking you live to the front lines of the day's biggest stories.
Welcome to Gabala. Hi, Candy. One important note. To Fierce. I'm here.
Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Hello, we are reporting on the 8th of November.
Reporting from Paris,
Dar es Salaam, Tel Aviv,
Washington,
London,
Moscow,
Kyiv, Berlin,
Rio de Janeiro, Beijing, Bangkok, Tbilisi, Tashkent, Almaty, Kazakhstan, Port Sudan, Tehran, Islamabad, Istanbul,
Kabul, Port Aimu.
And welcome to Primetime. What a show we've got lined up for you. In a complex world, clarity is power. Two hours live, diplomacy dissected in a spin-free environment. That's Prime Time with me, Guy Schoen, weekdays on A News.
Welcome back to Daybreak. Now let's take a look at the rest of the global stories. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky have voiced support for reviving the Istanbul peace process on Wednesday. They also emphasised the need for a just and lasting settlement to end the war following high-level talks in Ankara.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky met on Wednesday in the Turkish capital Ankara. Erdogan welcomed Zelensky, who is paying a working visit to Turkey at the presidential complex. Following their private meeting and a working dinner, Presidents Erdogan and Zelensky addressed the media in a joint press conference. Speaking at a joint news conference with his Ukrainian counterpart, Erdogan said Ankara believes it would be beneficial to implement the Istanbul process within a comprehensive framework capable of addressing the now acute challenges of the conflict.
We believe it would be beneficial to reactivate the Istanbul process with a more comprehensive approach that addresses the problems that have become acute. We expect all our partners who desire to halt the bloodshed in the region to adopt a constructive approach regarding the Istanbul process.
Zelensky thanked Turkey for what he called its principled stance on Russia's war, saying Ankara's support for Ukraine's independence and sovereignty is very important for Kyiv. Ukrainian president also stressed that the war must end.
We talked substantively about the situation in diplomacy, and now many processes have become more active, and we are trying to ensure that all activity is aimed specifically at peace, a just peace and guaranteed security. The war must end. There is no alternative to peace. Russia must understand that there can be no reward for waging war and committing killings.
Zelensky added the two leaders discussed defence industry cooperation and that teams on both sides agreed to strengthen joint production projects.
Now, Britain is issuing a sharp warning to Moscow after a Russian spy ship used lasers to disrupt Royal Air Force pilots monitoring its movements near UK waters. Defence Secretary John Healey says action by the vessel, known as the Yantar, was deeply dangerous and is being treated with the highest concern.
As I speak, a Russian spy ship, the Yantar, is on the edge of UK waters north of Scotland, having entered the UK's wider waters over the last few weeks. This is a vessel designed for gathering intelligence and mapping our undersea cables. We deployed a Royal Navy frigate and RAF P-8 planes to monitor and track this vessel's every move, during which the Yantar directed lasers at our pilots. That Russian action is deeply dangerous. And this is the second time this year that this ship, the Yantar, has deployed to UK waters. So my message to Russia and to Putin is this: we see you, we know what you're doing, and if the Yantar travels south this week, we are ready.
Now, it's quite interesting seeing that, because it's almost a sense for how far will Russia go to poke the bear, to poke Europe.
So this is the thing, I think it's quite audacious actually of them to do that in UK waters, just because of, obviously we know the rhetoric in regards to the support for Ukraine that Europe is having in relation to the war there, but at the same time Russia is really testing its luck. We know that drones have flown into certain airspaces, Lithuania, Denmark, a number of different places, and now they're using waters to, like, as you mentioned, poke the bear, so to speak. I don't know whether or not we'll be the bear. I think we're not as strong as a bear, as Europe.
But I do think, if I'm right in saying, this is the first nuclear power that Russia has, gone and overstepped the mark. I mean, in Europe with the drones, I don't think any of them have been nuclear power. So this is like a direct test to a European nuclear power, like I say.
Definitely a flex of arms. And how do you think the UK should, obviously we've just seen Defence Secretary there, John Healey. How do you think UK will respond to that?
Next week they have a mini budget, 26th of November, which will set out all the defence spending. Now, I know we're going to talk about COP later, but I think a lot of countries now are focusing rather on the climate than to defence spending.
Yes.
So we're seeing 5% GDP, which is a huge increase. It was just 2 to 2.5 about a year ago. So definitely a change in tact, definitely a change in feeling, and it's almost as if it is when, not if.
Well,
I hope I'm wrong. I really do.
We'll have to wait and see exactly what that looks like. But now we turn to the US, and the American Justice Department is set to release all files from its investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. It's after US President Donald Trump signed a new transparency bill on Wednesday. The move is expected to shed more light on the late sex offender's activities and connections to prominent figures.
All files related to a long-running investigation into late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein are set to be released. US President Donald Trump signed legislation on Wednesday ordering the Department of Justice to release the documents. In a post on his Truth Social platform, Trump framed the move as a transparency measure and used the moment to criticize Democrats over their alleged past connections to Epstein. The scandal has been a thorn in Trump's side for months as he previously resisted calls for full disclosure, but he shifted his position after mounting pressure from Epstein's victims and from within the Republican Party. He's always denied any wrongdoing. However, the material could shed more light on the activities of Epstein. Before his 2008 conviction on charges of soliciting a minor for prostitution, he died in jail in 2019 while facing federal sex trafficking charges. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the Justice Department will protect victims' privacy, so some details may be withheld, such as sensitive information for ongoing investigations. The bill, known as the Epstein Files Transparency Act, passed the House with a 427-1 vote and cleared the Senate by unanimous consent on Tuesday. The documents must be made public in a searchable format within 30 days.
Who are beside me here today.
Now, tensions in Gaza are rising again as fresh Israeli airstrikes and conflicting accounts from both sides cast new doubt on the stability of the month-old ceasefire. Authorities on the ground report growing casualties while political pressure intensifies following a newly endorsed 20-point plan for the Strip's future.
4 Israeli airstrikes across Gaza on Wednesday killed at least 25 people, according to local health authorities. It marked one of the most serious escalations since last month's US-brokered ceasefire. The heaviest casualties were reported in Gaza City's Zaytun neighborhood, where a religious endowments ministry building was hit, which killed 10 people. Additional strikes hit Shajaya, Khan Yunis and the Mawasi area. Israeli military said it targeted Hamas positions after gunmen opened fire on its troops in Khan Yunis, killing 3 of its soldiers, calling the incident a breach of the ceasefire. Hamas dismissed Israelis' account and described the strikes as a dangerous escalation, urging Washington to pressure Tel Aviv to halt its attacks. Wednesday's violence follows 2 earlier flare-ups in October, though the ceasefire remains officially in place. The latest incident comes shortly after the United Nations Security Council endorsed US President Donald Trump's plan for the Strip's political transition and reconstruction. Gaza's health ministry says 280 people have been killed during this ceasefire.
Now, Thursday marks 80 years since the opening of the Nuremberg trials, the landmark proceedings that first held Nazi leaders personally accountable for crimes committed during the Second World War. The tribunal would go on to define the principles of modern international justice and shape the courts we know today. Here's a look back at the moment that changed global law.
Nearly 80 years ago, on the 20th of November in 1945, the world witnessed a moment that reshaped international justice. In a Germany still in ruins after the Second World War, judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union gathered in the city of Nuremberg. they opened the first ever international military tribunal, a court created to put the surviving leaders of Nazi Germany on trial. For the first time in history, top political, military and administrative officials were held personally accountable for crimes committed by a state. 22 of the most senior Nazi figures were brought before the tribunal, charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy. 12 would eventually be sentenced to death. 3 were acquitted, the rest received long prison terms. Hermann Göring, once one of Hitler's most powerful deputies, was convicted but died by suicide just hours before his execution in October 1946. The Nuremberg process continued beyond the first tribunal. Between 1946 and 1949, the United States held 12 additional trials, prosecuting 177 Nazi officials, from SS commanders and generals to doctors and industrialists. In total, 199 people were tried in Nuremberg, 161 were convicted, and 37 were sentenced to death. Nuremberg became the blueprint for modern international justice, the ancestor of today's tribunals and the International Criminal Court. And although some of the major perpetrators never stood trial, the proceedings mark the first time the world said, collectively, that such crimes would not go unanswered.
Now, Cuba faces worsening blackouts as fuel shipments from allies, including Venezuela, decline. Residents struggle with daily life while the government warns of ongoing electricity shortages and rising energy challenges. Here's more.
Cuba's power outages are worsening as key fuel suppliers, including Venezuela and Mexico, have cut shipments. The island relies heavily on imported refined products for electricity and transport, and U.S. sanctions and economic crises have long constrained its ability to secure enough fuel.
I think that for now the power cuts are not going to improve. On the contrary, they are going to get worse, but I don't know why, because they are getting worse. There are more blackouts every day. For example, in my experience, I have to live with electricity because I don't have gas. I live with 1 gas cylinder per month, and sometimes it doesn't reach. I have a 1.5-year-old child, and it's very difficult for me to live with this situation. But what can we do?
Imports from Venezuela, Cuba's main political ally, have dropped 15% to around 27,000 barrels per day, with fuel oil for power generation most affected. Total imports from all origins fell 38% compared with last year. Almost 800 megawatts of power generation, over a quarter of daily demand, are offline due to fuel shortages and lack of lubricants. Scheduled and unplanned outages in Havana now sometimes last 9 hours, while provinces may get only 2 to 4 hours daily. Aging infrastructure and damage from recent hurricane. Melissa worsened the situation, leaving former thermoelectric facilities idle and highlighting the urgent need for fuel and repairs to restore the country's power supply.
We're going to take a break now. When we return, we'll discuss the key regional headlines with an in-studio guest to help us unpack more. You don't want to miss it. Welcome back. Now let's take you through the news of what is happening across the region. Now, the United Nations has briefed the Security Council, warning that Syria's humanitarian situation is extremely serious. More than 16 million people need assistance, and sanctions are slowly in reconstruction.
The UN Security Council held a briefing on Syria's political and humanitarian situation. Deputy Special Envoy Najat Rochdi described conditions as extremely serious, with more than 16 million people in need and hundreds of thousands displaced. She welcomed the removal of UN sanctions on President Ahmad al-Sharaa and Interior Minister Anas Khattab, but urged lifting secondary sanctions that block reconstruction and economic recovery. Rochdi highlighted the need for transparency in the Transitional People's Assembly and called drafting a permanent constitution a foundational task for the political transition. Lisa Doughton of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, speaking for Emergency Relief Coordinator Tom Fletcher, said the nationwide ceasefire largely holds in southern Syria, though sporadic sectarian clashes continue in Ceuta between Druze militias and tribal fighters. Over 180,000 people remain displaced in Ceuta and neighboring areas. The UN reaches 357,000 people per month via 1,300 plus aid trucks in partnership with local authorities. While 1.2 million refugees and 1.9 million internally displaced have returned, many still face shortages of food, housing, healthcare, and water. Doughton called for sustained international support, funding, and long-term investment. UN aid operations reach 3.4 million people per month, though only 26% of the response is funded. Rochdi also stressed accountability for past sectarian violence, minority and women's inclusion in governance, and the importance of international support for long-term reconstruction. She called for targeted investment to help Syria move beyond emergency aid and build a stable, united, and prosperous future.
Well, joining us in studio now to help us understand this in greater detail is Arthur Block, Executive Editor-in-Chief of The Liberian. Good morning, Arthur. Thank you very much. We've had a good chat just before that.
Yeah, we did indeed.
Can we just talk about how you would assess the UN's stance on Syria and what progress could be made here?
Well, a lot of progress has been made in the eyes of the international community, of course. We have Syria, we had a leader who was on the terrorist list, 10 million bounty on his head because of atrocities he committed. All of a sudden he is the savior of the country, and he is asked basically in his UN resolution to break with his old allies. He has to go after the Islamist jihadist who helped him into power. And if he doesn't, then the United Nations has the right to intervene with force. So it's basically selling out your allies, your buddies. And that's an interesting development. I mean, things move very fast.
Is that safe for him? Is that going to cause problems with the longevity?
Well, we just published an article on the Liberum this morning. There's a lot of these groups that held meetings in the past week, so how do we continue? Because Syria is not under the control of the government yet. It's like these areas with these people, and it's complicated. It reminds me a bit of the Lebanese civil war in the 70s and 80s. You have areas from the country under control of different militias and different groups. So it's a beautiful resolution, but it will take let's say some effort, that's even understated, to enforce it.
Yeah, so in that sense, what is the long-term impact of the policy that could shift things and how the international community approaches post-conflict transitions today?
In general, in regards to Syria?
In regards to Syria.
Well, if you look carefully at the resolution, you would see that basically it's being divided. Mm-hmm. So you have Russia will get the coastal regions where the Alawites are, and they have a military base for decennia already. The central area will be for the Syrian defense forces, the Syrian army, and then the south, where the Druze live, a large population of Druze, minority, because it falls under control of Israel. So it's a breakup basically of a country. Now, from international dynamic perspective, you could say, well, it makes a country like Saudi Arabia stronger. You have an Arab state, Syria, that used to be quite large, with a backup of the Iranians. So Iran collapsed, as we all know. Well, at least their proxies did. And yeah, now Syria is basically broke down in pieces, so it becomes weaker. That's, from a Lebanese perspective, not so bad, because we have been under the tutelage of the Syrians for decennia.
You say it breaks down into pieces. So.
Yeah, well, but not. On paper, it looks quite nice, but that's what it means, basically.
You don't think a stable government humanitarian improvements could materialize following this UN decision?
Well, of course, after such a resolution, that paves the way for money. If he just signs, which he does, of course, and his government, because also his Minister of Interior is being removed from the terror watch list. These guys were militia fighters, so they are not your ordinary soldiers or anything. They came from and committed the most terrible atrocities on the people. Now they're expected to help the people that they conquered. So we have to see what's going to happen. I'm a bit skeptical, as you can hear, but still hopeful that Syria will normalize the situation. And of course, the poverty of the people goes to the roof. It's extreme. We have in Lebanon alone hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees, not to mention the Syrian refugees in Europe, in Germany, the Netherlands, France, name them. They're everywhere. And of course, because it was an unlivable situation.
And what do you think is driving the current pace of this political and humanitarian progress on the ground, do you think?
Well, it's a complicated question, but I think what is the dynamics right now is Trump focusing on the Middle East. We saw that yesterday, 2 days ago, the Saudi Crown Prince was at the White House making huge announcements about massive investments in the US, and Trump profiles himself as the president of peace. Now, I think he invited the Syrian president al-Shara to the White House a few weeks ago to show that, look, I'm even on top of this. Basically, everywhere that I put my hands on, we will have an improvement in the situation. And I think it's a personal thing for Trump. So that means that it's on the top of his agenda. And that's a good thing, because if everybody's watching, then it's easier to improve a situation and the livelihood of people.
The power vacuum that emerged from Syria and Assad, we've had, is it almost a sense of, okay, we were going to have a replacement, he was always going to be an ex-military, he was always going to be HCS. We found a moderate in al-Sarraj that can work with the world.
He is not a moderate, that's the big misconception. He profiles himself now as the moderate president, but he is an Islamist. I mean, it was Al-Qaeda and ISIS, this coalition, basically kicked out Assad, and it was a very awkward weekend. We had, on a Wednesday in Lebanon, signed an agreement with Israel to stop fighting. So and 3 days later,
do you believe
Assad was in Damascus?
Do you believe he could become a moderate? Well, he could embody these Western ideals?
Let's not forget, he's an interim president. He's not there to stay. I think his only role is calming down the situation, normalizing it, and call for new elections. And then if people like him, then he could become the president. But there should be elections. You cannot appoint yourself as being the savior of a country.
No, but it seems like it's likely to happen only because he seems to have very good relations now with President Donald Trump. Yeah. And obviously that was the first time that the Syrian president...
Yeah, it has been a while that there is a good relation between the Syrian president and the American president. Correct,
exactly. So to see that on the global stage and to see so much, eyes and attention on it will give some kind of, hope that things can be stabilized, people can start living their lives in a better way.
Absolutely. And it's about time, because the people of Syria are suffering for what is it, 14, 15 years now. I mean, don't forget why they rose up against Assad in the first place, because they were also suffering, low wages, I mean, poor infrastructure, basically no future hope for the people. And I think there's a good momentum now. Let's give al-Shara the benefit of the doubt, and let's see what he makes of it.
And just quickly on that, obviously Russia's influence with the previous government there, he's now lost that with this new, with Assad. Do you think that's something that now the US is getting involved, that Russia's influence now is kind of depleting in the Middle East?
In the end, that's the whole purpose of American involvement, to marginalize the Russians. So they have some military bases in the coastal areas, let's say north of Beirut, north of Lebanon, and they are still relatively strong there. I don't really know how strong they are, because, as I said, it took 3 days for Assad to flee to Moscow. He's still there. This is also an unresolved dossier. What's going to happen with Assad? Is he going to be extradited? Does he have to be put in front of an international court? A lot of things are pending, and I think the first step now is to, let's say, more or less try to normalize the situation on the ground, the status quo, and then see if they can improve the life of the people, and then things will follow, hopefully. But there need to be new elections. You cannot have another dictator in place that says, well, I'm now the president, I'm going to stay there for 5 to 10 years until I decide it's the right moment to have election.
Let's draw a little parallel, though. So we see in Ukraine, Zelensky. There's been martial law since the war. He's been president for longer than the term usually states. I'm not going to label anything. We know Donald Trump has previously alluded to the fact that he's a dictator. He said that on social media. But that is because of the martial law. Is Syria not going through the same period where there is no infrastructure, there's no development yet to have fair, good elections yet?
Syria is not a third world country. I mean, traditionally they had a good infrastructure. There's various level of governing. There's a municipality, there's regional. So it's possible, but there needs to be a will to organize it. I mean, I'm not going to comment on Zelensky because I'm not an expert on that dossier, but I think it's not impossible to, first we create stability. we're far from that in Syria. If you've seen the massacres in the coastal regions of the Alawites and St. Druze, that's why this United Nations resolution is so important. So it gives a bit of a framework towards a normalization. And it's just a paper yet, but the threat of this, if it's not implied, then the international community holds the right under Chapter 7 to use force. It's interesting. They're basically saying, if you do not abide by this resolution, we can have an international force in no time ready to help you stabilize the country. Now, and I don't think that's in al-Shara's interest to have an international force on its ground as of yet.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your insights today. Really interesting. And we'll keep the eyes on the involvements from Syria as well.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Block. Thank you. Right, well, the interim government of Syria owned political protests. What mechanisms actually exist to ensure inclusivity and across ethnic, sectarian and regional lines, given the scale of what is going on? That's exactly what we just kind of delved into right now with our guests. Now we're going to turn to Armenia and Georgia, who are strengthening their partnership with President Khachaturian's visit to Tbilisi. Leaders from both sides say regional stability is now their shared goal. Our political correspondent Nini Nikolashvili has more.
The president of Armenia, Vakhagan Khachaturian, has begun his official visit to Georgia, welcomed at Tbilisi International Airport by senior Georgian officials. An official ceremony was held at the presidential palace, where Khachaturian was hosted by Georgian President Mikhail Kavalashvili. Talks between the two presidents placed Georgia-Armenia strategic cooperation at the center. Both leaders underlined that relations built on mutual respect, sovereignty and cultural identity have deepened significantly in 2025. This visit marks their second high-level meeting this year, highlighting the pace of diplomatic engagement. Kavalashvili emphasized Armenia's consistent support for Georgia's territorial integrity, calling the partnership exemplary across political, economic and multilateral platforms. He reiterated that maintaining stability in the South Caucasus is becoming increasingly vital amid shifting global dynamics. President Khachaturian echoed these priorities, stating that the two nations have elevated their centuries-old friendship into a formal strategic partnership. Discussions covered economic, cultural, educational and youth cooperation, with both sides signaling readiness to expand joint projects. A major theme was the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace agreement, recently initialed and widely considered as a turning point for the region. Both leaders expressed confidence that a durable peace will transform the South Caucasus into a competitive logistics corridor, a development that could reshape trade routes and regional connectivity. Khachaturian also announced Armenia's preparations for upcoming international conferences, noting Georgia's expected participation as part of expanding multilateral engagement. As the visit continues, including meetings with Prime Minister Irakli Qobakhidze and Parliament Speaker Shalva Papuashvili, the message from both countries' capitals is clear. A stable South Caucasus and strengthened bilateral cooperation are now shared strategic priorities. Nini Nikolashvili, Tbilisi, A-News.
Azerbaijan is playing a critical role in stopping narcotics before they reach Europe. Positioned along major drug smuggling routes stretching from Asia into Europe, the country has intensified border controls and operational measures to intercept illegal shipments. Let's take a closer look at this story.
Positioned along major drug smuggling routes stretching from Asia into Europe, Azerbaijan has become a critical security barrier between producers in Asia and markets in the West. As transit volumes increase, so does the scale of the threat and the response. On November 15th, that response delivered a significant result. Acting on precise operational intelligence, customs officers inspected a rail wagon traveling from Iran to Estonia. Inside, they uncovered a massive shipment of heroin, valued at more than $90 million on the black market. More than 450 kilograms were removed from circulation in a single operation.
As suspicious features were observed, the wagon was involved in 4 further base customs inspection. During the base customs control, reaction of service dog to pack of tile adhesive increased our suspicions. After inspection by the Gemini portable identification device, example of the unknown substance had been determined to be a substance of heroin.
And this is not an isolated case. In 2025 alone, Azerbaijani customs prevented over 1.6 tons of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances from reaching their final destinations, mainly European countries. Each interception represents potential distribution networks disrupted, criminal revenue denied, and lives protected.
Furthermore, as a result of customs control and operational measures carried out by our customs authorities, a total of 6 tons and 715 kilograms of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances was destroyed by burning, according to a court order in 2025. As a State Customs Committee, we are cooperating with several European countries and several international organizations such as Europol and CEPOL. We usually take close interaction with them about our cases, and they are very interested and appreciate our efforts on combating illegal drug trafficking to Europe.
Through strengthened border control, advanced risk management and international cooperation, Azerbaijan is reinforcing its position as a security shield, protecting not only its own citizens but also global partners across Europe and beyond.
Those were your top regional stories. After the break, we will come back and be joined by an expert to discuss the recent information in regards to Ukraine President meeting with Turkey's President Erdogan. Don't go anywhere.
Now we turn to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has been meeting a number of European leaders to increase support for Ukraine while Russian attacks intensify. And yesterday, Zelensky met with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Ankara. We're now going to take a deeper look at what this meeting highlighted with a live guest. Nadia, over to you.
I am now joined by former diplomat of Turkey, Melih Demirtaş. Welcome to the program this morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
No problem. My first question is, we know that Zelensky has been meeting with a number of European leaders about the ongoing war in Ukraine and the need for support. How does Turkey fit into that?
Yes, Mr. Zelensky makes his best. I think in these last, especially months, he is everywhere. We've seen his diplomatic, this very fast movements from Europe to United States to, of course, Turkey and several other platforms in multilateral platforms. We always seen that Mr. Zelensky maybe also attributes a special importance to this talks and diplomacy. I think after Spain, he just visited our country and he has an important, maybe a constructive dialogue again with our President Erdogan. But it is not this first visit of Mr. Zelensky. As you may remember, several times we already hosted Mr. Zelensky just in 2025 this year. But also we had important talks between Russian and Ukrainian sides in Istanbul. And I think Turkey fits really well in these projections because with the power of diplomacy, as also Mr. Zelensky, I think, repeated in this last meeting yesterday, this diplomacy power of Turkey, really what the actors must have this, especially in such a period, because the bombardments still going on, the unethical side of the war still going on, both in Russian and Ukrainian territories. And now I think this spirit of diplomacy is what we need, thanks to, of course, Turkey and other actors.
Definitely. And Turkey is a friend of Kyiv and of Moscow. But how might that be a challenge for President Erdogan to manage these two relationships and still support Ukraine?
If you look at the real projection or real meaning of diplomacy, I think we must not, first of all, call this as a challenge, because this challenge is maybe for realpolitik, as I always said, in the realist perspective, but in this real essence of diplomacy, I think this is also what we are having in the hand of a diplomat or in the hand of a skillful, maybe statesman. Because if we are losing all the connections with one side, who has an important power. We must accept that Russia has an important historical, sociological, still economic power, all the threats of embargoes from Western states. Russia already found many ways to maybe continue such a war, such conflict also, which costed hundreds of thousands of people from Russian and Ukrainian sides. But still, Turkey knows this. I think first aim is to have an important measure to maybe have such a loss of because as you also remember from this last attacks of Russian drones, as I said, this unethical side of this war. First of all, we saw maybe in Palestine, and now in Ukrainian territory, these unethical drones, we can call it quote unquote, already lost also maybe some ethics of conflict, if some ethics we have in conflict of history of conflicts. We also seen that many losses of civilians in different territories. And now Turkey is also seeing this and said to maybe Russia, first of all to Mr. Putin, and now of course to Mr. Zelensky, that they must come together. Because we had already some important talks between the experts, between the high-level diplomats, but what we are maybe not having in hands now, a real maybe leaders summit. And this leaders summit is we needing, and in the third round of this last meeting series in Istanbul, we also highlighted this, underlined this. These leaders meetings between Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky is now what we are really expect in this conflict.
Indeed, because we know that Zelensky got fighter jets from Paris, and Spain has pledged its military support as well for Ukraine, and then obviously Turkey playing that mediator role. Do you think there is enough support for Ukraine to actually win this war against Russia?
Nadia, this war projections also changed. As I said, this ethics of war or ethics of conflicts also changed. If you compare it to the 19th century, even to 20th century of Cold War, maybe ideology of war, everything's changed now. I mean, you can use hundreds of thousands in one night to a real maybe a blow to other territory. I mean, it can cost hundreds and thousands of civilian life also. So if a war is now happening in this territory, I mean Ukraine, also in Russian territory, we can say that many sides can continue to lose, maybe till the last person. Because of this, yes, the other parties, the other actors, even it can be France, United Kingdom, even Spain, they can, of course, provide some other weaponry, some other technology to Ukrainian sides. But we must not forget that we have another side of the world. And we already, as I said in my last answer, we already seen that Russia has also many connections with the other side of the world. I mean, let's say with China, let's say with North Korea, even with other actors of BRICS membership, for example. So we can say that no, the war cannot have one maybe victorious side, and Russia and both Ukraine can lose at the end of the day. So what we must not provide much more weaponry, but what we need is this, as I said, this real summit between the leaders, maybe thanks to this Istanbul spirit, or thanks to this maybe bilateral relations like Mr. Zelensky and Erdogan's yesterday.
And Mr. Demirtas, just very quickly, Zelensky is going to be speaking with US officials today in Kyiv in regards to a draft plan that we now realise is a 28-point plan that has said that, you know, wanting to take territory for Russia and limit or reduce military capacity of Ukraine. Do you think that's a good deal? Do you think that's something that the Ukraine president will take on?
The territory concessions and the territory loss of Ukrainian side, it is, of course, this unacceptable sites, for example, for the leader of Zelensky, but not for the leader or the population, community of Ukraine. So first of all, these sides, I think, must really come together. I mean, Russian and Ukrainian sides. Of course, the mediation of United States is valuable, but still we are seeing that some internal problems also is going on nowadays in Ukraine, thanks to this, I don't know, because of some corruption issues of Ukrainian politics and etc. But we can see that this United States mediation is needed, but it must not, first of all, underline this loss of territory of the Ukrainian side at the first point. First of all, we must underline, as I said, all this maybe stop of this military maybe clavages or military heavy attacks of the Russian side, and this territorial, I mean, cultural or historical reasons of Russia must be maybe discussed in the second round of or third round of this discussion.
Great. Thank you so much for your insights and to speaking to me today, Mr. Demirtas.
Thank you, Mr.
Well, that's a wrap of our Global Talk. We're now going to take a short break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. You're watching Daybreak with me, Nadia Jani.
And me, Lou Brown. Let's get you straight back into the key stories shaping the world and the region this morning.
Here are your top stories. Russian drone missiles kill at least 25 people, and US and Moscow officials draft plan to end war.
US President Donald Trump signs bill that orders the release of the Epstein files.
And at least 25 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli strikes across the Gaza Strip. Ukraine has been hit by one of the largest Russian aerial attacks in months, striking multiple regions and causing heavy casualties. Alongside this, US and Russian officials have quietly drafted a new plan to end the war in Ukraine, but it would require Kyiv to surrender territory and severely limit the size of its military. Here's more on that story.
At least 26 people have been killed in a major Russian missile and drone attack on the western Ukrainian city of Ternopil, according to officials. The upper floors of a residential building were torn away, and debris and personal belongings were scattered across the area as thick smoke rose over the city. More than 90 people were wounded.
As you can hear, the equipment ceased its operation. A moment of silence has been declared to be able to hear possible survivors under the rubble. Around 30 minutes ago, we made contact with a young person in their 20s. The rescuers keep constant contact with him.
The military says X-101 cruise missiles hit the residential block in Ternopil, which is a city close to the Polish border that has rarely been targeted.
My son is still in the apartment on the 9th floor. I talked to him before the explosions. That's it. He said, "Mom, everything will be fine. Don't worry." After this, I tried calling and couldn't reach him. I know nothing.
Ukraine says Russia fired 476 drones and 48 missiles overnight, hitting energy and transport sites and forcing emergency power cuts during freezing temperatures. Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk regions were also struck, while drone attacks in Kharkiv injured more than 30 people, setting buildings and cars on fire. Ukraine's Air Force reports shooting down 442 drones and 41 missiles, including 10 intercepted by F-16 and Mirage 2000 jets provided by Western allies. Russia's defense ministry says it carried out a massive strike using long-range precision weapons, claiming it targeted Ukraine's military industry and energy sector. It says it's in response to Ukrainian attacks on civilian sites inside Russia. The attacks come as President Volodymyr Zelensky travelled to Turkey for talks aimed at reviving peace negotiations. He urged Kyiv's allies to increase pressure on Moscow and provide more air defence missiles. A high-level US military delegation, led by Army Secretary Dan Driscoll, arrived in Ukraine to discuss efforts to end the war. The team is expected to meet Zelensky in Kyiv after his return from Turkey. Ukrainian officials said the delegation was briefed on Russia's troop build-up, ongoing offensives and recent attacks on civilian areas.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky have voiced support for reviving the Istanbul peace process on Wednesday. They also emphasised the need for a just and lasting settlement to end the war, following high-level talks in Ankara.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky met on Wednesday in the Turkish capital Ankara. Erdogan welcomed Zelensky, who is paying a working visit to Turkey at the presidential complex. Following their private meeting and a working dinner, Presidents Erdogan and Zelensky addressed the media in a joint press conference. Speaking at a joint news conference with his Ukrainian counterpart, Erdogan said Ankara believes it would be beneficial to implement the Istanbul process within a comprehensive framework capable of addressing the now acute challenges of the conflict.
We believe it would be beneficial to reactivate the Istanbul process with a more comprehensive approach that addresses the problems that have become acute. We expect all our partners who desire to halt the bloodshed in the region to adopt a constructive approach regarding the Istanbul process.
Zelensky thanked Turkey for what he called its principled stance on Russia's war, saying Ankara's support for Ukraine's independence and sovereignty is very important for Kyiv. Ukrainian president also stressed that the war must end.
We talked substantively about the situation in diplomacy, and now many processes have become more active, and we are trying to ensure that all activity is aimed specifically at peace, a just peace and guaranteed security. The war must end. There is no alternative to peace. Russia must understand that there can be no reward for waging war and committing killings.
Zelensky added the two leaders discussed defence industry cooperation and that teams on both sides agreed to strengthen joint production projects.
Britain is issuing a sharp warning to Moscow after a Russian spy ship used lasers to disrupt Royal Air Force pilots monitoring its movements near UK waters. Defence Secretary John Healey says the action by the vessel known as the Yantar was deeply dangerous and is being treated with the highest concern.
As I speak, a Russian spy ship, the Yantar, is on the edge of UK waters north of Scotland, having entered the UK's wider waters over the last few weeks. This is a vessel designed for gathering intelligence and mapping our undersea cables. We deployed a Royal Navy frigate and RAF P-8 planes to monitor and track this vessel's every move, during which the Yantar directed lasers at our pilots. That Russian action is deeply dangerous. And this is the second time this year that this ship, the Yantar, has deployed to UK waters. So my message to Russia and to Putin is this: we see you, we know what you're doing, and if the Yantar travels south this week, we are ready.
Now, Ukraine is facing one of its most serious political crises of the war after lawmakers dismissed two ministers tied to a major corruption probe. The investigation centers on an alleged $100 million scheme to control contracts at the state nuclear agency, raising new concerns about graft inside the government. Let's continue a little bit longer into our next story. I'll let you take over here, Nadia.
Over to the US now, where US American Justice Department, Donald Trump has signed the bill that directs the Department of Justice to release files from the investigation of the Jeffrey Epstein case. It's in connection to prominent figures to find out what exactly happened during that court case. Here's more.
All files related to a long-running investigation into late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein are set to be released. US President Donald Trump signed legislation on Wednesday ordering the Department of Justice to release the documents. In a post on his Truth Social platform, Trump framed the move as a transparency measure and used the moment to criticize Democrats over their alleged past connections to Epstein. The scandal has been a thorn in Trump's side for months as he previously resisted calls for full disclosure. but he shifted his position after mounting pressure from Epstein's victims and from within the Republican Party. He's always denied any wrongdoing. However, the material could shed more light on the activities of Epstein before his 2008 conviction on charges of soliciting a minor for prostitution. He died in jail in 2019 while facing federal sex trafficking charges. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the Justice Department will protect victims' privacy, so some details may be withheld, such as sensitive information for ongoing investigations. The bill, known as the Epstein Files Transparency Act, passed the House with a 427-1 vote and cleared the Senate by unanimous consent on Tuesday. The documents must be made public in a searchable format within 30 days.
Beside me here today. Tensions in Gaza are rising again as fresh Israeli airstrikes and conflicting accounts from both sides cast new doubt on the stability of the month-old ceasefire. Now we will continue a little bit longer into our next pictures.
Israeli airstrikes across Gaza on Wednesday killed at least 25 people, according to local health authorities. It marked one of the most serious escalations since last month's US-brokered ceasefire. The heaviest casualties were reported in Gaza City's Zaytun neighborhood, where a religious endowments ministry building was hit, which killed 10 people. Additional strikes hit Shajaya, Khan Yunis and the Mawasi area. Israeli military said it targeted Hamas positions after gunmen opened fire on its troops in Khan Yunis, killing 3 of its soldiers, calling the incident a breach of the ceasefire. Hamas dismissed Israelis' account and described the strikes as a dangerous escalation, urging Washington to pressure Tel Aviv to halt its attacks. Wednesday's violence follows 2 earlier flare-ups in October, though the ceasefire remains officially in place. The latest incident comes shortly after the United Nations Security Council endorsed US President Donald Trump's plan for the Strip's political transition and reconstruction. Gaza's health ministry says 280 people have been killed during this ceasefire.
An Israeli strike on Wednesday rocked the Tyre facility, southern Lebanon, killing at least 1 person and prompting residents to flee several villages after warnings of further attacks. Residents fled several villages, and after warnings of further attacks, the Israeli military said it targeted Hezbollah militants, while attacks on Deir Kiffer, Shehor, Anita, Tafei, Filse sent plumes of smoke into the air. On Tuesday, an Israeli airstrike in al-Hiwai, Palestinian refugee camp near Sudan, killed 13 people.
Now, today marks 80 years since the opening of the Nuremberg trials, the landmark proceedings that first held Nazi leaders personally accountable for crimes committed during the Second World War. The tribunal will go on to define the principles of modern international justice and shape the courts we know today. Here's a look back at the moment that changed global law.
Nearly 80 years ago, on the 20th of November in 1945, the world witnessed a moment that reshaped international justice. In a Germany still in ruins after the Second World War, judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union gathered in the city of Nuremberg. They opened the first ever international military tribunal, a court created to put the surviving leaders of Nazi Germany on trial. For the first time in history, top political, military and administrative officials were held personally accountable for crimes committed by a state. 22 of the most senior Nazi figures were brought before the tribunal, charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy. 12 would eventually be sentenced to death. 3 were acquitted, the rest received long prison terms. Hermann Göring, once one of Hitler's most powerful deputies, was convicted but died by suicide just hours before his execution in October 1946. The Nuremberg process continued beyond the first tribunal. Between 1946 and 1949, the United States held 12 additional trials, prosecuting 177 Nazi officials, from SS commanders and generals to doctors and industrialists. In total, 199 people were tried in Nuremberg, 161 were convicted and 37 were sentenced to death. Nuremberg became the blueprint for modern international justice, the ancestor of today's tribunals and the International Criminal Court. And although some of the major perpetrators never stood trial, the proceedings mark the first time the world said, collectively, that such crimes would not go unanswered.
A political dispute between China and Japan is rapidly spilling over into tourism and business, triggering major cancellations and economic concerns. Our reporter Mahor Makhdoom has more from Beijing.
Tensions between China and Japan have escalated sharply after Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi made comments regarding Taiwan, potentially justifying military intervention. Beijing strongly condemned these remarks, viewing them as provocative, and issued a travel advisory urging Chinese citizens to avoid Japan, citing personal safety concerns. The travel advisory has triggered a wave of cancellations among Chinese travelers. In the last 2 days, nearly 500,000 flight bookings to Japan were cancelled. Chinese airlines and tour operators are offering free cancellations or full refunds for tickets booked through the end of December. Estimates suggest that a sustained drop in Chinese visitors could result in an annual loss of about $14 billion and shave about 0.2% of Japan's GDP. Cultural exchanges have also been impacted, with Japanese film screenings in China postponed and some travel agencies temporarily halting new visa applications for Japan, showing a growing nationalist sentiment and caution among travelers. Japan has already dispatched senior envoys to Beijing to seek de-escalation, but for now, immediate effects are clear: travel cancellations, refunds, and trade disruptions, as both countries continue to navigate the delicate balance between economic interest and national security concerns. Manu Makhdoom, A-News, Beijing.
Over to COP, and it's good news for Turkey, who are set to host COP31 next year after reaching a compromise agreement with Australia. Under the plan, Turkey would serve as COP31 summit president and host the main event, while Australia would take charge of negotiations and a pre-COP meeting would be held in the Pacific. The move comes as a resolved standoff between Australia and Turkey, as both bid to host it and both refused to stand down. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has called the compromise an outstanding result.
No, we're very pleased with the outcome. Turkey will host the conference, but Australia, by having the COP presidency for negotiations, will be in a very strong position, and some might argue in the strongest possible position, because we will benefit from having Pacific issues and the issues confronting Australia that we know Australia is particularly vulnerable for the extreme weather events which we are seeing more intense and more frequent.
Well, we got our answer.
Yeah, we did.
We were talking about it yesterday.
A good compromise?
Well, yeah, I don't think it's bad. I think both of them, we know that they couldn't co-host, and that's what the president of Australia was saying. You can't co-host, but they can be in support of Turkey taking the lead, and then them and Australia and Pacific Islands also having an input on it.
Mm-hmm. I know, as we talked about before the show, how the Pacific Islands maybe have a little bit of a hump about it. Because they are greatly affected by climate crises, and they feel like their voice should be heard, and their evidence is great as well. So they're definitely a little bit annoyed, let's say.
They are a bit annoyed, and yes, Papua New Guinea in particular has definitely spoken out about it. And as you mentioned, climate change is impacting a number of their countries and islands around the Pacific Islands. But we'll see. At least we got the reason as to who's going to take the helm of the reins for COP31. We'll see how it goes, and hopefully it will bring better solutions to this crisis.
Hopefully, and not just to finish on, they have a lot of diplomatic meetings next year. Turkey, they've got NATO coming, they've got COP coming.
All eyes are on Turkey.
Yeah, it's going to be a busy week, months in the region.
For 2026.
We're going to be busy here in these chairs, that's for certain.
Indeed. Now we move over to an interesting auction. Sotheby's auction house has sold a Gustav Klimt painting for a record-breaking $205 million on Tuesday in New York. It's the work of art of a portrait of Elizabeth Lederer, who was painted between 1914 and 1916 and was created during the Austrian artist's final years. Take a look at this.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to an unequivocal masterpiece of Vienna's golden age. Gustav Klimt's magnificent portrait of Elizabeth Lederer.
The bidding began at $130 million at Sotheby's auction house in New York. Gustav Klimt's portrait of Elizabeth Lederer fetched a record-breaking $205 million Tuesday evening. With fees, the buyer will pay $236.4 million. It reached the price after a 20-minute bidding battle involving 6 bidders. The 20th century masterpiece became the second most expensive artwork ever sold at auction and the most expensive modern piece.
$205 million. And the hammer is coming up, ladies and gentlemen. I think this is it. At $205 million. Here it is for this Elizabeth Lederer portrait, only at Sotheby's, here in the Breuer. The Klimt, Julian, is yours. Congratulations. Congratulations.
The portrait, depicting the young daughter of one of Klimt's patrons and created in the final years of his life, survived the Second World War after being separated from other pieces of his works that later burned in a fire at Immendorf Castle in Austria. The 1.8-metre tall painting shows the subject wearing Chinese-inspired clothing, standing before a blue tapestry decorated with Asian motifs. It is one of only 2 full-length Klimt portraits that remain in private hands. Across the sale, most artworks met or surpassed their high estimates, including a Klimt landscape at $86 million. In total, 5 Klimt works from the collection sold for $392 million.
Congratulations. Thank you, David. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Let's take a short break. When we return, we'll bring you the top stories from the US and Europe. Don't go anywhere.
And welcome to Primetime. What a show we've got lined up for you. In a complex world, clarity is power. Two hours live, diplomacy dissected in a spin-free environment. That's Prime Time with me, Guy Schoen, weekdays on A News.
President Trump and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman met in Washington to sign a multi-billion-dollar deal. The agreements boost US-Saudi ties in technology, defense and energy. Our correspondent Ubay Shabanda has more.
Well, it was a day of deal signings between President Trump and the future king of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, in the Kennedy Center. The president and bin Salman announced billions of dollars, upwards of $1 trillion of deals signed between American companies and Saudi companies in mining, in energy, in healthcare, in AI. We saw Elon Musk come on the stage as well as the U.S. Secretary of Commerce and the Saudi Minister of Trade, amongst many others. A day that was full of a number of meetings between American companies and Saudi companies as part of an effort to strengthen U.S. and Saudi bilateral strategic ties. Of course, it comes on the heels of President Trump officially designating Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally, expanding American defense cooperation with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and making it easier for American defense companies to do business with the kingdom. This is also part of an effort by the president to expand American weapon sales to Saudi Arabia with the F-35 deal, the advanced stealth fighter jets being concluded, with President Trump agreeing to sign off on the sale of this advanced fighter jet to Saudi Arabia. Of course, Saudi Arabia being the only Arab country in the Middle East to receive the F-35. Israel is the only country up until now in the region that is sold the advanced stealth fighter jet with a long-range capability. And of course, this underscores America's strengthening ties with Saudi Arabia on a number of fields that Saudi Arabia plays an important role in American economic investment. And for the Saudis, American technology, American investment, and of course, American know-how in a number of fields that are critical for domestic manufacturing are key for Saudi Arabia's ability to advance its domestic economy and to advance its international global trade as part of an effort by Riyadh to move away from total dependence on energy exports for the country's economic well-being. I'm Ube Shabander, A News, Washington, D.C.
We now have a roundup of news in Europe. The European Union is rolling out a plan for a military Schengen to speed up troop and equipment movement across its continent. The announcement comes as EU foreign ministers meet in Brussels to discuss support for Ukraine and wider global tensions. Europe now faces the challenge of turning this ambition into real defence capability. Our Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where the EU unveils a landmark plan to create a military Schengen, allowing troops and equipment to move swiftly across EU borders in a crisis. And just as the proposal lands, EU foreign ministers are gathering in the Belgian capital this morning to discuss support for Ukraine and rising global instability. The European Commission just published details of its military mobility package. By 2027, the aim is an EU-wide military Schengen with harmonized rules and dedicated corridors across land, air, and sea, eliminating regulatory and physical bottlenecks that slow deployment during crises. It creates a single authorization system for military transport, prioritizes access to essential corridors and ports, and introduces a shared EU solidarity pool for logistics and transport assets, plus national coordination to streamline implementation and align standards with NATO. In a nutshell, being able to cross borders with troops and equipment in less than 6 hours in case of an emergency. Framed as a cornerstone of Europe's strategic autonomy, the plan is ambitious but faces challenges: securing funding, harmonizing national rules, and completing major infrastructure projects. At today's foreign ministers' meeting, Russia's aggression against Ukraine will be the main focus, after an informal exchange of views with Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Now, since the start of the war, the EU and its member states provided over 187 billion euros, with more likely on the way. Other regions will also be discussed at the meeting, including the current situation in Sudan and the Middle East. Just this week, the UN Security Council approved a resolution endorsing a U.S.-drafted roadmap for the Gaza Strip that includes deployment of an international stabilization force and a transitional authority to govern the enclave until a recognized Palestinian entity takes over. Overall, the EU foreign minister's agenda, coupled with the military mobility package, point to a continent racing to adapt to a far more dangerous world. Europe is signaling it wants to move faster and harden its defenses, but ambition alone will not be enough. The real test now, delivery, whether member states can match political statements with funding, infrastructure, and unity. As geopolitical pressure grows, Europe finds itself at a crossroads. Either it turns this moment into genuine strategic strength or risks being overtaken by events. For AE News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Now to something that you don't see every day, especially not with the leader of Russia. President Vladimir Putin attended an exhibition designed to showcase Russia's largest bank's technology advances. And he was in for a treat after a humanoid robot danced for him on state TV, dancing to what it said was its favorite track. Before the performance, the artificial intelligence machine explained what it was.
My name is Green. I am the first Russian humanoid robot with embedded artificial intelligence. This means that I'm not just a program on a screen, but a physical embodiment of technology.
I mean, I don't really have...
That is impressive. And the fact that President Putin was there, do you think he was amused or entertained by that robot?
I don't know. Okay, if President Putin was in front of you, would you use those dance moves?
I don't think I could actually pull it off.
No, do you want to try and replicate?
No, I'm not even going to go down that route, but thank you for the invitation. But yeah.
It reminds me of something of the ilk of when Boris Yeltsin used to dance. You know, he was quite popular, but before Putin's era, he used to whip out a few dance moves.
A few dance moves, but it was nice to get a bit of a grin rather, from the Putin in regards to this technological AI robot. It's a thing that is upcoming that people say.
Well, there was a video that circulated a few days before, and the robot actually fell over face first.
I did see that. That was not as...
I think Europe might be laughing, though.
Yeah. Well, it was very interesting to see, and to see the robot actually try to make Putin laugh. So
yes, definitely not a scenario you ever see with the Russian president.
Not at all. He doesn't like to break face. Anyway, that was your news update for the day. Thank you for watching Daybreak with me, Nadia Jani.
And me, Lou Brown. You're up to date with the world news for this morning. From all of us in the studio, thank you, and see you tomorrow.